presentation is doing Evangelical Public Theology, the Gardner approach as a methodology. And in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to take you through what it means to do Evangelical Public Theology using the Gardner approach. My presentation has the outline and introduction, followed by definitions of public theology and that of the Gardner. Then the Gardner theologian comparisons will also follow. Then we will look at the methodology itself and look at an application, how it is applied to a certain topic and how it has been applied and what conclusions we can draw. So basically that is the outline of the presentation this afternoon. Even though the subject of public theology is popular and widespread, especially in contemporary times, it lacks a definite and authoritative methodology. This paper is a contribution to the search for a methodology for this relatively new brand of theology. The main argument is that the work of the Gardner represents a powerful metaphor for understanding the task of the public theologian because the two vocations are strikingly analogous in nature and scope. So what then is public theology? I reviewed a number of literature and realized that public theology can be considered from different perspectives. Smith outlines at least 6 theories related to the origins, nature, and scope of public theology. After going through all the literature available to me, I have the following working definition of public theology. And my working definition this afternoon is that public theology may be defined as the engagement of theological perspectives and principles with broader societal issues, public discourse, and challenges of the contemporary world. Public theology seeks to bridge the gap between religious beliefs and the public sphere, aiming to contribute meaningfully to discussions on morality, justice, ethics, human rights, politics, and many other societal issues. As a matter of fact, I do admit that all theologies are actually public in nature because they are all related to public issues or they all strive to have public consequences. However, the discipline which has been designated public theology is more public-oriented than the other traditional theologies such as systematic theology, biblical theology, and practical theology or missiology. Also, public theology is interdisciplinary and operates differently and exists alongside the traditional theological disciplines to perform a task that no single discipline can perform. So more or less, it integrates the other sub-disciplines and even goes beyond that to relate to other non-theological disciplines. It is also important this afternoon to define what or who the Gardner is. My search led me to understand that the term Gardner means different things in different contexts. For example, a gardener may be a person who cultivates flowers and maintains lawns by sodding, reseeding, mowing, pruning, and applying fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. In another context, especially in Europe and other parts of the world where we have snow, a person who removes snow and ice from roadways, building entrances, parking lots during winter, and the person also does landscaping is referred to as a gardener. However, in this work, the gardener is a person who cultivates crops for public consumption or use and appreciates their aesthetic value of these crops. So the gardener in this context is more or less a farmer. So that is how we have to understand the gardener in this context or in the context of this paper. I then come to the similarities between the task of the theologian the public theologian or even other theologians, and the gardener. First of all, both tasks are biblically grounded. Public theology is biblically grounded, or it is based on biblical theology. Evangelical public theology, the Bible is the first and final authority in the theological discourse or formulation. Similarly, the work of the gardener is based on biblical principles, though not every aspect can be deduced directly from the Bible. For example, there is this biblical principle of sabbatical rest for agricultural lands in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 4. And this relates to the idea of crop rotation, where the gardener ensures that after cultivating the land, he or she allows the land to rest for some time before he cultivates again. One may say that in the modern world, you can continue cultivating a particular piece of land for a long time without even doing this sabbatical rest or this kind of crop rotation. That is true. However, it is important to realize that aside this, there are other ethical issues that are derived from the Bible that are applicable to the work of the gardener. Therefore, we can say that the gardener's work is also biblically informed. The next similarity is that both of them are problem-solving oriented tasks. Public theology is meant to provide a political direction that's addressing the needs of the society. A public theologian is a community-oriented person who provides orientation, direction, and even guidance for policy making and decision about public life. And here I quote Smith. Similarly, the gardener interprets the environment in which he or she is and addresses human needs in the light of what he or she can produce. The life of the community depends on what the community eats. Therefore, it is important that a holistic policy making in the society incorporates what the gardener has to say in terms of the kind of food that need to be produced or that can be produced based on the available land. The third is that both are intercontextual in approach. Public theology takes in a wide range of contexts, that is different communities, different regions, and different disciplines. This feature is important in this age of globalization, where the concerns of a local community easily attains a global dimension. In the same way, the gardener, like the theologian, has an intercontextual nature, because that work, which is the gardening work, takes place in a diverse context, each of which has something to contribute to the overall understanding of the vocation. The gardener learns from what is happening in other fields, both locally and globally. I also believe that both of them are interdisciplinary in nature. The scope of public theology goes beyond a single theological discipline, as I've already mentioned. It goes beyond biblical studies, practical theology, missiology, systematic theology, to draw on other disciplines such as economic sociology, ecology, health, education, political science, history, law, and others. In the same way, gardening is an interdisciplinary task, drawing from agriculture, economics, health, social, accounting, marketing, ethics, and philosophy. It draws from these fields and other fields. The gardener needs to know the economic health and social values of crops before deciding what to do with the land that he or she is about to cultivate. And finally, we are saying that both of them are multilingual in nature. When we talk about the two being multilingual in nature, the public theologian, because what he's doing is interdisciplinary, will have to know the vocabulary that is used by the lawyer, by the politician, by the economist, to be able to carry out his task very well. Similarly, the gardener encounters people of diverse linguistic tradition and diverse background, and so needs to be multilingual. Here, we are not talking about different dialects, but we are talking about he meeting people like the taxi driver to transport the produce to the farm, then meeting traders. He has to, at least, be in their shoes, speak as they will understand, and so he has to learn from all the people that he encounters, and in so doing becomes multilingual. What then is this Gardner approach that I'm presenting this afternoon? The Gardner approach, ladies and gentlemen, can also be called the farmer approach, and it is the theological research methodology based on parallels between the works of the gardener or the farmer and the public theologian. This theological model applies basic principles of crop production to the formulation of public theology. I'm the one who formulated it, and so I formulated this in the second quarter of 2023 after reflecting on the works of the farmer and the works of the theologian, public theologian for that matter. The formulation was done primarily for public theology, but I later realized that it also works well for systematic theology, and a modified version can also be used for, say, practical theology. It is made up of the following steps, the Gardner approach. It has 5 key steps, and the first one is expropriation phase. I coined the word expropriation by combining 2 words, exploration and preparation. What that means is that in step 1, there is exploration and preparation. So we say that the main task is to prepare the socio-political soil. The main question that the theologian will ask is this: what socio-political environment needs to be addressed? So over here we are saying that in the case of the gardener first of all explores the land or the field that he's going to cultivate. The gardener does so by looking at the soil type, the soil profile, the color, texture, structure, porosity, climatic conditions, and after that he demarcates, weeds, removes stumps, and prepares the land for cultivation. So that is the exploration and preparation phase in the case of the farmer. Relating this to theology, one realizes that one of the key tasks that the theologian has to do, and in the Gardner approach, it is the first of them, is to explore and prepare the socio-political environment or society for theologizing. So he looks at the social context of the people. Here we're talking about human relations. What is the concept of the people concerning the human person and the community? There is also the need to look at the political context or the political worldview of the people. Kinship is an example. Religious beliefs about the supreme being, great powers, ancestors, divinities, and others is also important during this first stage. And the theologian is also expected to look at the economic context or worldview of the people. It has to do with issues about buying, selling, international trade, and others. Step 2. Step 2 is planting phase. After the person who is farming, after the farmer has actually prepared the land, cleared it, then prepared the soil, there is planting. In terms of theology, the planting has to do with planting the theological seed. Here, the main question is, what might an exegetical study of relevant theological seed? The seed is a metaphor for biblical text reveal about the sociopolitical environment to be addressed. In this particular methodology, the seed is a metaphor for the biblical text. In some other methodologies, you realize that it is the biblical text or the biblical exploration that comes first. But I realize that the seed is central to the work of the theologian, especially the evangelical public theologian. So I was looking for a metaphor within the farming task, which is central. And I realized that it is the seed, which is central, because without the seed, we have no seedlings. Without the seedlings, we have no crop. Without it, you cannot move on to have a harvest. And so the metaphor is strong enough to ensure that whatever theology is done, scripture becomes central. So we are saying that the gardener identifies suitable seed and prepares it on the nursery bed for transplanting later to the field. Now, the point is that after exploring the society, the community that one is going to theologize for, it is important to use the outcome of that exploration and preparation to decide which biblical texts are going to be explored. So just as the kind of land, the kind of soil determines the seed, the kind of socio-political environment or society and the challenges they are facing will lead the theologian to selecting relevant texts. Identifying and studying biblical texts to arrive at a credible biblical theology on the subject is one of the main tasks here. And the choice, as I've already mentioned, is based on the result of the exploration. There is a theological transplanting in this particular step, which is a sub-step. Just as the gardener will have to nurse the seeds, have seedlings, and then transplant, there is also the need for theological transplanting. And this metaphor is explained as follows. The biblical text in its original socio-political context, as it was delivered to the first audience, represents the seedlings on the nursery bed. Then the biblical text, how it relates to the contemporary socio-political environment, represents the crop or the seedling in the gardening field. And so the transplanting then becomes exegesis, trying to understand what the text meant in the original context and then trying to carry that meaning to the contemporary context. At the end of the day, we expect the theologian to come out with well-arranged thematic presentation of biblical theology, which will form one of the major components in the theology to be formulated later. There are some gaps that need to be bridged. Bringing the seedlings from the nursery bed to the field, if one doesn't take care because of difference in temperature, difference in environment, some of the seedlings may not survive. And so there is the need to bridge the gap. Similarly, it is important to bridge the gap between the biblical world and our world. And I identify about 3 of them. I'm talking about cultural gap here. For example, if one hears about the wearing of sackcloth, practices such as holy case, then head covering in the Bible, these have cultural connotations, and one has to bridge the cultural gap. There is also the need to bridge the literary gap, difference in genre, whether the genre is coming from wisdom literature, the law, apocalyptic, or whatever, then structure and organization of the text as well as movement. Then we also have progression of the text from the beginning to the end. These are important issues that need to be addressed in order that we will have the seedlings coming from the nursery bed to the field without losing any of them. We also need to bridge the grammatical gap. Here we are talking about the Hebrew language being strange to some of us, Greek, Aramaic, and even the meaning of words, phrases, clauses, and so on and so forth. These are all important, and the gardener theologian will have to bridge these gaps in order to have the seedlings being transported or transplanted without any challenges. In step 3, we are talking about maintenance. Step 2 will end at a point where the seedlings have actually taken root and they are now crops growing towards maturity. And here there is the need to maintain them. So we are talking about maintenance phase for stage 3, and it is important that the gardener theologian maintains the theological crop. The main question to ask in this particular step has to do with how have people maintained this theological crop within their socio-political environment or milieu. The gardener studies and selects relevant cultural or maintenance practices, pruning, staking, weeding, application of fertilizer, and he also tries to invent new ones. For example, in Ghana here recently, there is this invention of hand pollination of cocoa, which was not something that we used to know. We allowed them to pollinate um, naturally, but now we are talking about hand pollination. So you can reinvent or you can invent new ones, add to the old. Similarly, the Gardner theologian studies historical theology either synchronically, that is, in a specific historical, or diachronically throughout church history to learn from the mistakes of former theologians and their strength and build upon what they did, avoiding their mistakes and refining their theology to have a contextual application. The Gardner theologian must endeavor to re-engineer both historical and contemporary practices, as I've mentioned earlier. Step 4, harvesting phase. This is where there is theological formulation. The main question is, how might a theological fruit be produced to address the needs of the sociopolitical environment? So it is important for the Gardner theologian to look back to the society or the context in which he is theologizing and to ensure that the harvest meets their demand. The harvesting of fruits come after all land preparation, sowing, germination, growth, fruit bearing, and maturity have taken place. The quality and quantity of the gardener's harvest depends on the gardener himself, the soil, the crop, and the cultural practices. So the point is that in the case of gardening, the gardener, the soil, the preparation, then the seed, the maintenance, these are the key components that will determine the kind of harvest one is going to have, both the quality and the quantity. In the same way, during the theological harvest, we have the factors like sociopolitical context in which we are working, the biblical theology that we have already formulated, then historical theology or church tradition. But before the harvest comes, there is pollination. And this is a metaphor for the interdisciplinary nature of the public theology. And so we are saying that there should be a credible and critical interaction among the three parties: the soil or the sociopolitical context, the seed planted, which is the biblical theology, then the maintenance or cultural practices, which is historical and contemporary theology, which one re-engineers. The main task is to formulate. So the public theologian or the Gardner theologian will use the sociopolitical context, the biblical context, and the historical data to come out with a formulation of a theological theological principles based on the results that he has already obtained. So that is what we are referring to as the harvest. That is the theological formulation. Of course, the theological formulation must also be clear, logical, thematic, and must have some applications. After harvest, it is important to distribute the crop or the harvest for consumption. I must say that when we talk of consumption here, we are not talking about eating alone. It can happen that it is used for aesthetic purposes. It could happen that it is used for some other medicinal, whatever purposes. So consumption simply means using what has been produced. Here, we talk about implications. What implications has the theological fruit for consumers? Without consumption or use, the gardener's effort have been in vain. The theological fruit, therefore, must be distributed from the gardening site for public consumption. For distribution to be done effectively, the gardener has to indicate clearly what is to be sent to the various consumers or markets for further distribution, or marketers for further distribution. Here we are talking about implications of the theological formulation for relevant individual organizations and institutions. The theologian indicates the role of the various agencies, such as the individual. What is the role of the individual in what we're talking about? What is the role of the church, the society, and the government in the full implementation of the policy that is formulated by the Gardner theologian? Now, putting all of them together, it gives us this diagram where we have on the extreme left the historical theological data, biblical theology, contextual realities in three different boxes. And you see the arrows going up and down, meaning that they all have to interact. And when they interact, they now produce the theological fruit, that is the theological formulation, and that leads to consumption. So this is how the Gardner approach is represented diagrammatically. Having presented this approach, I now move on to application, where I'm going to come out, or I'm going to use a topic as a hypothetical situation, and we see how the Gardner approach is going to help get the research questions. Then after that, what methodological steps we can take. So the project title is A Political Theology for Nigeria and Its Implications for Environmental Care. The main research question is, how might a political theology be formulated to address Nigeria's environmental issues? The subsidiary questions are as follows. The first one relates to the first step, and the first question is, what is the socio-political situation in contemporary Nigeria? So this corresponds to the exploration and preparation in the case of the gardening enterprise. The second one is, what might an exegetical analysis of suitable biblical passages on the political environment of Nigeria reveal? In other words, having explored the Nigerian socio-political situation, we are now in the position to take some text and do exegesis to have biblical theology waiting for us to use later. The third step, which has to do with cultural practices or maintenance of the crop, we have how have theologians throughout church history developed their political theologies in the light of their sociopolitical settings. The fourth question is, how might a political theology be formulated to address the sociopolitical needs of contemporary Nigeria? And this is the theological harvest stage. Then finally, what implications has a political theology for Nigeria for her environmental care? Now, the methodological steps can be summarized as follows. So the student or the researcher comes to methodology, and the steps will go this way. Step one, that is the expropriation phase. The main task will be to examine the general political situation of contemporary Nigeria to discover the issues that need immediate attention. This can be expanded, but for the sake of this presentation, it is as brief as that. Then we have the planting phase. The phase will focus on an exegetical analysis of selected biblical text. And here I'm looking at Amos 5, 1 to 27, Romans 13, 1 to 3. These are hypothetical texts that we don't have to be so how technical about. Related to political, let me take it again. The Gardner theologian will have to conduct an exegetical analysis of the selected text that relate to the political theology that is about to be formulated. The third step has to do with maintenance. And so there will be a survey of perspectives from scholars on political theology or something like that throughout church history. Here I'm looking at people like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, John Wesley, Jaggy Multman. In the fourth step, we are saying that using the result of the first three steps as contextual frameworks, the fourth step will formulate a political theology for contemporary Nigeria. Here, themes such as governance, nation building, education, work, and environment may be considered. Finally, the political theology formulated will then have ramifications or implications, and that is what will be done in step 5. Now, what are the strengths of this methodology that I have presented? The methodology ensures that scripture takes a central position in Christian theology. I must say that before formulating this, one of the immediate how do you call it, the immediate prompts that led to the formulation of this particular methodology was that I realized that there are a lot of people who are saying that they are doing theology, and yet the Bible is not taking a central position. And so by metaphorizing the seed as the biblical theology or biblical text, it becomes important that one includes biblical theology in the formulation. So I believe that one of the strengths is that it makes the Bible central, and that is important for all evangelicals, and for that matter, Christianity in general. Once the theological seed is selected based on the socio-political environment, it becomes the controlling factor in the theological gardening enterprise. Because without the seed, nothing can be done. The seed determines the kind of land preparation, the cultural practices one should employ, and the kind of theological fruit that may be harvested. Thus, the gardener approach ensures that theological formulations are biblically based without ignoring historical theology and context of the receptor community. Another strength is that this approach is practical and accessible to almost all persons because agricultural activities form the primary context for human life. But especially in Africa, where farming or agriculture is a major occupation, this method proves very useful and practical, as opposed to some abstract nature, the abstract nature of some theological methodologies. But there is a limitation. So far, I've identified one limitation. And the limitation is that the metaphor that I have presented this afternoon works well for seeds that we need to nurse before we transplant. And again, the farmer or the gardener should be involved. So if the kind of farming or gardening is such that the involvement of the gardener is not so much, then the metaphor is not so strong. If it happens that there is no nursing, then the metaphor part of it may not be that strong. So far, that is the limitation that I have identified. But that notwithstanding, we all know that no metaphorical expression or no kind of comparison can be perfect. Whatever we do, even in the Bible, for example, referring to Jesus as the second Adam, we realize that there are some points that they may not be correspondence. So it is important that we know this, but that doesn't mean that the methodology is not strong enough and applicable for us. In conclusion, I will say that I have argued that the work of the gardener provides a useful model for formulating evangelical public theology. The Gardner approach emphasizes the centrality of the Bible in theological discourses. The Bible is indispensable in theological enterprise, just as the seed is indispensable in farming or gardening. By making scripture an indispensable partner in theological or ethical formulation, the Gardner approach promotes the evangelical perspective on the place of the Bible in theological formulations, and hence guards the theologian against the liberal tendencies that we sometimes encounter. Before I end, finally, I must say that when it comes to South African Theological Seminary, where I work and I'm presenting currently, you see the Bible centeredness is found in this particular methodology, and the evangelical nature is also found there. So I believe that as we continue to have further discussions, we can strengthen it, we can apply it, and also help to redeem evangelical theology. Thank you very much for your attention.